I love the term politically non-binary. I think it was coined by Konstantin Kisin, one of my favorite political commentators who co-hosts the podcast Trigonometry with fellow comedian Francis Foster, two guys who seem to live up to this label. It's great that you can't really tell if they're Democrat or Republican, and not simply because they're both Brits who live in England. You also really can't tell if they're mostly liberal or conservative, and it's because they seem to be among the few people who know that there's a time and place to be both liberal and conservative, particularly in the political blabosphere, which is a term I just made up. And by the way, there's a reason why I'm using this drawing I did back in 2018 of Adam Carolla and Jimmy Kimmel as the theater drama masks, where Adam Carolla represents comedy and Jimmy Kimmel represents tragedy, or in his case, the exploitation of other people's tragedies to make himself look like a hero who looks down on his own audience at times. Though I drew this back in 2018 when Jimmy Kimmel was crying about healthcare in this country, it's still relevant nowadays, given his recent indefinite suspension from ABC. For anyone who's unaware as to why I would pair these two together, it's because Adam Carolla and Jimmy Kimmel created The Man Show, which was on Comedy Central back in 1999. Since then, Adam Carolla took more of an independent route as a comedian, selling books and building his own podcast, which he has often referred to as his own pirate ship. Whereas Jimmy Kimmel took a more lucrative, yet conventional and safer route by hosting his supposedly own late-night show that really belongs to ABC, which is actually owned by Disney. And this is why Jimmy Kimmel ultimately became a household name, unfortunately, as far as I'm concerned. Because that's one of the downsides of capitalism. Sometimes it takes other people's money to make a truckload of your own money. And what often sells isn't always what's best for society, like cigarettes, for example. And it's a shame because when it comes to comedy, let alone truth-telling comedy, Adam Carolla was so much funnier, smarter, bolder, and I just simply relate to him way more than Jimmy Kimmel. Because Adam Carolla is also someone you could say is politically non-binary. Which is why the title of this video is We Need More Politically Non-Binary Independence, which I know doesn't just roll off the tongue. But it's something we definitely need in our culture because we are needlessly and avoidably dividing ourselves as a nation. The amount of people who refuse to speak to one another over just ideas, and worse yet, demonstrably false, predictably ruinous ideas, is a sad testament to how humanity continues evolving. And status-obsessed celebrities like Jimmy Kimmel function as hired mouthpieces for major corporations and the Democrat Party in particular to continue dividing and conquering consumers as well as voters. But that can change. And it's not so much a matter of uniting and holding hands across the world and singing Kumbaya. But we can stop the divide and the avoidable conflicts. We can see through the falsehoods. And most importantly, we can learn to spot the opportunists that are pushing these falsehoods because they profit more from the problems than the solutions. Namely, celebrities that care more about their fame and legacy than they care about what is true and what are good ideas or bad ideas that they push onto the public night after night in what are supposed to be comedic dialogues but come across as condescending, pedantic lectures. And that latest example is Jimmy Kimmel, who was just suspended indefinitely for his remarks about Charlie Kirk's murder. By the way, he wasn't fired, and much less was he arrested, as many people are trying to make him out to be some free speech warrior, as if our nation is on the road to right-wing authoritarianism under Trump. And these are the words that got him suspended indefinitely.
We had some new lows over the weekend with the MAGA gang desperately trying to characterize this kid who murdered Charlie Kirk as anything other than one of them and doing everything they can to score political points from it. In between the finger pointing, there was grieving.
Is that the clip? Really? Because that's just Jimmy Kimmel. I mean, given the FCC's response, I was expecting something more, provocative. That's like hearing that Playboy has a racy new centerfold and finding out it's just Jimmy Kimmel.
And right before posting this video, I checked the news and saw that Jimmy Kimmel was back on the air. So much for the end of free speech as his whole suspension was being portrayed as, which I don't think he should have been suspended for those comments in the first place. But it should be pointed out that his comments were toxic and poisonous to the unity of our country, not to mention factually incorrect given the motives that were known about the killer by the time Jimmy Kimmel shot his mouth off. And truly in poor timing considering the grieving that Charlie Kirk's family was going through. After all, if Jimmy Kimmel could cough up a self-righteous tear for Cecil the lion, some poor animal that was hunted down and became a news sensation 10 years ago, it's interesting the lack of emotion he couldn't muster for Charlie Kirk's widow at the very least. And the fact that he used the words MAGA gang were most telling when trying to pin the blame on what he looks down on as half the country, when all he's really doing is projecting his own prejudice and bigotry for anyone who could see through his bullshit. And all for what? To score brownie points with his celebrity ilk, mostly out in Los Angeles, where the entertainment industry employs tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people, all looking to be famous. And therefore, those people all depend on each other for work, for their livelihoods, and then a status hierarchy forms between those who wildly succeed and those who barely get by, and even have to live in dilapidated trailers on the side of the streets, despite working full-time jobs. People who can barely afford rent, much less buying overpriced homes in Los Angeles. Which is why you get so many people deathly afraid of saying the wrong thing, even if that wrong thing happens to be the truth. Such as we are a sexually dimorphic species that can only naturally procreate between a male and a female. And there's no need to use the new terms of cisgender males or females when the words men and women are more than enough. But the fear of being called transphobic overrides the courage to speak real truth to actual power. And then there's the fear of being called a racist for pointing out the demonstrably false narratives pushed by Black Lives Matter's founders and its many chapters claiming that there was a systemic killing of Black Americans by white police officers, which in turn caused hundreds of avoidable riots throughout 2020, which were the direct result of dozens of people dying. All during a presidential election year, by the way, which was most likely the reason behind the exploitation of George Floyd's death. And so many other falsehoods that almost function like left-wing religions when you think about it. Which brings up the unfortunate fact that we also need to call out the equally damaging falsehoods from the right as well. It's not as if it's only left-wing, attention-seeking, status-climbing glory hounds and elitist snobs in cities like Los Angeles and New York City that are the problem. Because there's also a serious problem with claims by people such as Charlie Kirk, who would say things like this on his channel.
Is in Leviticus 18, is that thou shalt lay with another man shall be stoned to death. Just saying. So, Miss Rachel, you quote Leviticus 19, love your neighbor as yourself. The chapter before affirms God's perfect law when it comes to sexual matters.
And while many people are pointing out that Charlie was being taken out of context because he was merely trying to show how a particular YouTube personality, Miss Rachel, was cherry-picking Bible quotes to prove a point, the fact that Charlie refers to the stoning of gays as God's perfect law when it comes to sexual matters doesn't help either. Being coy about stoning people to death for their sexuality is a recipe for disaster in societies. And just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's a perfect law, and much less that it's true or let alone a good idea. Especially calling for the murder of quite possibly at least one relative in everyone's family, given the ratio of homosexuals to heterosexuals in our species. Almost everyone nowadays has at least one gay relative in their family or knows of a gay coworker. And quite often the people who doth protest too much about gay rights are usually projecting their own sexual insecurities and quite possibly a double life they're trying to deflect attention from. And clearly Charlie Kirk's mentioning that some gun deaths are justified in keeping our rights to bear arms is quite possibly his most haunting quote. However anyone wants to interpret that one, considering the absolute inordinate amount of school shootings that go on in this country, and the fact that Charlie Kirk was murdered at a university of all places. While there was an overall generally positive message that Charlie Kirk was trying to communicate, namely the value of raising a family with someone you love and building stable homes which lead to stable societies, Charlie also said a lot of things that were not only factually incorrect, but that could be just as intentionally provocative and divisive as the pseudo-intellectual woke horseshit that passes for profundity in society thanks to the collective cowardice of so many white-guilted, self-loathing progressives that are more deathly afraid of being called racist, transphobic, or Islamophobic than they are about being truly courageous and calling out what is true, or at least what's obviously bullshit. This is why we need way more politically non-binary independents in our culture, especially the ones that are at the very least secular. The ones who know that all religions are demonstrably false and that books such as the Bible and the Quran are not the words of some all-powerful, all-knowing, infallible supreme being dictated to men by angels. But these are just simply books written by desert-dwelling nomads from thousands of years ago who didn't realize they lived on a round planet as they were doing their best, however, to make sense of the world around them. Namely, all the chaos they couldn't control and the bittersweet observation that life is still worth living despite all the suffering and finiteness of existence. Because love is the ultimate ingredient that does make life worth living and even possible in the first place. If I got anything wrong in this video, please let me know in the comments below. But if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the links below for my original art and merchandise. And thanks for watching.